This is the Camp Iron Mountain Podcast, a place to learn about U.S. military history as told through the stories of service members, military units, and supporting civilians. Join us as we work to preserve their memories for future generations. Hello and welcome to the Camp Iron Mountain Podcast. I am your host, Gabriel Suarez. Thanks for joining me on our first episode. This is a new show to learn about military history as told through the stories of service members, military units, and supporting civilians. I want to share with you, our audience, the unique experiences that veterans and civilians endured during both times of peace and conflict. Most of the history we'll explore will be from conflicts in which the United States was involved in, but the stories we share will not solely be focused on the U.S. In most conflicts, the U.S. has always fought side by side with partners and allies from other countries and the host nation. These experiences generally get lost in conventional tellings of standard military histories, but are important in understanding the essential contributions of all nations and people. Secondly, this podcast will highlight the activities of individuals and organizations who are active in capturing, preserving, and making military history available to the general public. These far-reaching activities include everything from authors writing books, veterans associations that were formed to promote their collective unit history, folks who have set up memorial websites that honor military units, and also various individuals, archives, foundations, libraries, and museums that actively collect oral histories and historic military artifacts. These people and organizations are critical in preserving primary and secondary sources that allow future researchers and the public to learn about these important stories. Thirdly, there are untold numbers of people who toil away anonymously researching a family member's service and wartime experiences. The number of resources out there are vast and difficult to find unless a researcher has a background in knowing where to look. The task is often more complicated if the person conducting research doesn't have a military background. Understanding the differences between ranks, officer versus enlisted, knowing how military units are organized and deployed, etc., can often be like reading a different language if you've never been exposed to it before. This podcast and online social media community will be a resource for individuals to get educated on ways to find the information they may be looking for. And last, but most importantly, this podcast will share stories of living veterans. Living World War II veterans are in their 90s. Before COVID, an estimated 245 World War II veterans were lost each day. Living Korean War veterans are in their 80s. Vietnam veterans are already pushing in their 60s and 70s. Veterans who served in the post-Vietnam, late Cold War period are generally in their 50s and 60s. Veterans of the ongoing global war and terrorism conflicts are obviously much younger, but are starting to show their age, 20 years removed from the 9/11 attacks. The common theme among many vets, though, especially ones who served in a combat zone, is a reluctance to share their stories. There's an innate feeling many have that their personal experiences were not all that important, or that non-veterans wouldn't care to hear about what they did in the service. Sometimes, and understandably, veterans and civilians who have lived through a conflict close themselves off from talking about the experiences due to the hurt, the pain, and the trauma of a specific event or multiple events. Most other times, it's just old-fashioned life getting in the way. Our lives are busy with family, work, and hobbies. Deliberately taking the time to write down or record our memories is usually not very high on our daily priority list, if it's even on our mind at all. Staring at a blank page on your computer screen, waiting to type away, is very daunting. I hope this podcast helps inspire listeners to conduct their own research, write down their own stories, and ultimately share that history with others. I am a veteran myself, but I don't come from a military family per se. There's no overarching expectation that kids in my family join the military, but many have. My family's service in the military has largely been the result of varying circumstances, which at the time compelled them to join. One of my grandfathers was drafted into the Army and fought in World War II. My other grandfather enlisted in the Marine Corps during the Korean War. This was a chance for him to escape a potentially bleak future living in the poor Imperial Valley of California. Two of my uncles served. One was probably influenced by the eternally loved Be All That You Can Be promotional campaign of the early 1980s Army. My youngest uncle also signed up after high school, not really feeling the school thing. He followed in his older brother's footsteps and became a paratrooper. Two of my younger cousins also signed up to serve in the Army, and both deployed to the Middle East during their enlistments. The genesis of my desire to preserve history and eventually create this podcast comes from my grandfather. He was an infantryman during World War II. Growing up, he didn't talk much about his experiences during the war, which is common for his generation. Occasionally, he spoke of random parts of his service. I learned that he served in Europe with the 3rd Armored Division. He ended the war as a staff sergeant and a squad leader. He fought in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge, which is one of the few times he ever talked about his time in combat. It was the coldest time I had ever been in my life, he once told me. I could only imagine how cold it was because my grandfather grew up working on farms in Colorado and Wyoming, which are known for their own harsh winters. The Bulge is also where he said he got his second Purple Heart, taking shrapnel to his butt from a German grenade that exploded right next to him. Though wounded, it was not serious enough for him to be taken off the line, as his unit was seriously short on infantrymen at the time. During the World War II 50th anniversary celebrations in the early 1990s, my grandfather would clip articles from the newspaper and leave them out for me to read, with no explanation of what I was reading or why. He often circled random places on the maps that accompanied the newspaper articles. Mons, Stolberg, Cologne, Dessau, cities that had no meaning to me at the time. It was not until years later that I understood the importance these places had to my grandfather and his combat buddies. My grandfather died when I was in high school. With his passing, most of my questions about his time in the Army went unanswered. Fortunately for me, the men of his infantry company started publishing a monthly newsletter in the 1980s that chronicled how the men and their families were doing. For you younger listeners, a newsletter sent through the mail is basically how the world shared information in groups back in the day before Facebook and other social media. The newsletter also provided information on their upcoming annual reunions and made announcements of any new company men that had been found. They shared old pictures taken during their time in the service, and most importantly, they wrote articles about their experiences during the war. There was a concerted effort by these men to, 1, find each other. Most of this detective work was remarkably carried out by cold calling names from the phone book. 2, reestablish the connections and bonds they made during their short but defining time together during the war. And 3, preserve the memories of their service and comrades for posterity. All of their work was extraordinary, considering it was accomplished during the pre-internet and pre-computer era. Many of their articles were handwritten out or typed on a typewriter. Oral history interviews were collected with tape recorders at their annual reunions. Though most of the members of my grandfather's company have passed on, I'd have to say that their efforts to achieve the 3 priorities have been a success. The newsletter is still being mailed out today, carried on by the son of one of the company veterans. I'm currently in the middle of writing a book about their company during World War II, and the treasure trove of source materials these men have preserved has been invaluable. In closing this first episode, the basic gist of this podcast is to honor the legacy of those who came before us. We look to inspire others to conduct their own research, collect stories, and share their work with the public. If you want to be part of our community, please visit our website at campironmountain.com and subscribe to our email list. On our website, you will also find the links to join our private Facebook group and other social media sites. Join our efforts to preserve the important memories of our veterans and civilians for future generations. Goodbye and see you next time. If you like what you heard and would like to support our podcast, please subscribe and leave a review on Apple iTunes or whatever podcast player you're listening to us on. Positive reviews help others find the show.